Welcome back to another episode of the Four Archetypes. I am Dr. Lahab Al-Samarrai, and with me today, as always, Dr. Lisa Hong is with us. Dr. Eric Tomlinson is with us. Whitman is not with us. Whitman Davis is missing in action today, and we hope to have him back next week when we continue, as always, with Archetypal Symbols and Fairy Tales by Mary Louise von Franz. Okay, so why don't we get started? Usually, last week we had the Fitcher's Bird, and Dr. Lisa wasn't with us. Whitman was with us. So we talked about integration. We talked about development. We talked about coming to consciousness. Expansion of consciousness. We're always talking about expansion of consciousness. And if you remember some of our older podcasts, we talked about the upper world and the lower world, or the vertical world and the horizontal world. So we talked about also the dream world, the spirit world. Right. So we talked about all these different things, and what we were talking about is where you exist in space and time. Right. The fairy tale exists in a specific space and time. Right? The story exists in a specific space and time. And when the story occurs or has never occurred, it does not really matter. Once it starts to exist in that space of time, it takes that space and continues to exist in that space. And that's why we have so many fairy tales from thousands and thousands of years ago, even hundreds of thousands. We have stories from the beginning of our story, how we started, how we began, how we were created. So this is the importance of story, because story is psychology for the Jungians. But for all of us, think about it. Every story we tell, we're talking about us. We're talking about something about us. We're giving something of us to someone else. We're sharing. And sooner or later, that part that we share with them ends up being a part they share with others. Oh, did I tell you about my friend? So suddenly that story has expanded, and now it's kind of immortal because oh, have you heard the story? And it doesn't matter if it carries your name or not anymore. The story continues through time. And that's why we tell stories. That's why we love telling stories. Sometimes they sound a little kind of weird or ancient, and then we break them down, we interpret them. So without further ado, why don't we get into today's story? And this is a story. This is a Chinese story, and Emma Young tells this story, and we will get into the interpretation of the story after we tell you the story. So, Dr. Lisa, Dr. Eric, how are you guys doing today? And who would like to start?
Doing well, sir. I serve at your leisure.
Okay, then serve, my dear, serve.
Be happy to. The maiden who was stolen away. In the western portion of the old capital city of Luoyang, there was a ruined cloister in which stood an enormous pagoda, several hundred stories high. Not far from it, there lived a beautiful maiden. And one very hot summer's day, she was sitting in the courtyard of her home, trying to keep cool. As she sat there, a sudden cyclone came up and carried her off. When she opened her eyes, there she was on top of the pagoda, and beside her stood a young man in the dress of a student. He was very polite and affable and said to her, It seems as though heaven had meant to bring us together, and if you promise to marry me, we will be very happy." But to this the maiden would not agree. So the student said that until she changed her mind, she would have to remain on the pagoda top. Then he produced bread and wine for her to satisfy her hunger and thirst, and disappeared. He brought her everything she wished. He also hung up a great carbuncle stone so that the pagoda top was bright by night as well as by day. The maiden had all that a heart could wish, and yet she was not happy. But one day, when he went away, he forgot to lock the window.
The maiden spied on him without his knowing it, and saw that from a youth he turned himself into an ogre, with hair as red and madder, and a face as black as coal. His eyeballs bulged out of their sockets, and his mouth looked like a dish full of blood. Crooked white fangs thrust themselves from his lips, and two wings grew from his shoulders. Spreading them, he flew down to earth and at once turned into a man again. The maiden was seized with terror and burst into tears. Looking down from her pagoda, she saw a wanderer passing below. She called out, but the pagoda was so high that her voice did not carry down to him. She beckoned with her hand, but the wanderer did not look up. Then she could think of nothing else to do but throw down old clothes she had formerly worn. They fluttered through the air to the ground. The wanderer picked up the clothes and wondered if they might belong to his neighbor's daughter. So he took the clothes with him and showed them to the maiden's parents, and when they saw them, they burst into tears. The maiden had a brother who was stronger and braver than anyone for miles around. When the tale had been told to him, he took a heavy axe and went to the pagoda. There, he hid himself in a tall grass and waited for what would happen. When the sun was just going down, along came a youth tramping the hill. Suddenly, he turned into an ogre, spread his wings, and was about to fly. But the brother flung his axe at him and struck him on the arm. He began to roar loudly and then fled to the western hills. With the help of some neighbors, he climbed the pagoda and freed his sister and brought her safely home again. And that was the end of the enchantment.
Yeah, fascinating. Fascinating. So, okay. What do we think?
I'm wondering where the story is going because to me, on a literal scale, it sounds pretty simple.
Okay. Tell us about the story. What grabbed you in the story?
In general, well, in the end of the day, it is the young maiden who freed herself. But she freed herself by being resourceful and opportunistic and patient. And so even in a terrible situation, she controlled her choices and created a situation that was working for her so that she can wait for an opportunity. And one came and she seized it. And it yielded calling upon her brother warrior to come and rescue her.
So our maiden is trapped by a demon because it transforms to having wings and looking like an ogre. So it's a demon, it's a creature. And the demon has basically hoisted her up this, what in the old days would be a modern building. Pagoda has many different layers that reach into the sky. So it's like a modern day building. Not a very tall building, but tall enough. In those days, it was very tall. So at the top, to the point where when she's yelling at the wanderer, he can't hear her. And when her clothes drop to the ground, he doesn't look up. So there's something about looking up. There's something about being conscious, right? Why do we look up, right? Because when we're always staring at our feet, we have one perspective. We only see the ground. And that's a limited perspective. We look up, then we're able to see the sky. Right? Two different perspectives. Remember when I was talking about earlier, which was we talk about consciousness and the expansion of consciousness, the upper world, the lower world. Where do we live? Right? So at the beginning of the story, the maiden is hoisted up on this pagoda, right, all the way to the top. All right, so she's basically trapped. Now, as Dr. Lisa said, she has to find a way to make it back to Earth, make it back to home, make it back to being grounded, right? She floats up there, and she's being haunted by her internal demons, if we want to think of it that way. Her internal fear, right? And it has several different forms. So the animus takes several different forms. One is a demon. The other is a wanderer who's not very sharp. The other is a brave warrior, right? Remember, we talk about the archetypes. These are archetypes, right? The evil magician has her up on top of the pagoda. The lover comes walking by and sees clothes and knows those clothes. So he takes them to the parents and says, "Are these your daughter's clothes?" Well, how did you know they're clothes? You didn't even look up. Well, that's the lover archetype. And then the warrior archetype comes to save her with the axe. And Dr. Eric's cats. He comes to save her. So these are all the internal sources. The archetypal forces are all pieces of us. They complete us. They make us whole. And in this story, what you see is the way that the archetype thinks and moves and feels, how it strategizes, how it is complementary. And it's something that we're going to talk about in our conference on the 19th, 20th, and 21st at the Oval in Richmond, British Columbia in Canada. We're going to talk about how the four archetypes actually complete each other, how their movement helps integration, causes individuation, and moves us towards wholeness. It's understanding the archetypal patterns within us that liberate us from where we are trapped. In this case, our young woman is trapped on top of a pagoda. So, Dr. Eric, what were your thoughts?
Well, to tell you the truth, I like the fact that finally we've had so many stories of young, beautiful girls, maidens, whatever you want to call them, that are not developed yet, as most young people aren't. And they fall prey to something that looks good from the outside, that looks like it's going to take care of them, that has what a lot of people would want at a young age. And yet she's developed enough to where she doesn't agree. she's not fooled by him. She doesn't know he's an ogre at this point. He's just a handsome young man that's offering her everything that he's claiming to give her.
Well, she doesn't
And
trust. She doesn't trust that he is who he says he is.
right, well, that's
Because
that's
he
my
has her
point.
trapped on top of the pagoda. It was
Well,
okay.
that's
Why
what.
do you have me trapped on top of the pagoda if you?
Well, but the other young girls, they were trapped in a house and told not to go into a certain room. They were imprisoned as well, emotionally and psychologically, and yet they still stayed. They didn't fight it the way she did. I like the fact that she's developed enough to fight it. That's what I like.
Well, so the fighting doesn't start till the end, right? So you're like compacting the story. You're correct.
No, I
Wait,
disagree. I
wait.
disagree. The
I'm
fighting starts when she doesn't agree. That's
That's
when
what
the
I'm
fighting
curious
starts.
about. So, Eric,
Okay.
what do you see? What's your perspective on how is she fighting? And
Yeah.
this is reflective of Lori
She's
here.
not she's not giving it. She's using her insight and her mind and her thoughts along with her emotions instead of just her innocence of emotions to kind of go along. She's standing up for her own independence and not giving in to everything this man is offering and presenting to her.
Mm.
That is a form of resistance. That's fighting. It's fighting off something that many other people give into. That's impressive to me.
Ah, it's so
Okay.
interesting because from my perspective, I see that same effort that she is doing. I would call it austerity and self-control.
Mm.
And this is coming from my archetype interpretation. And I wouldn't use the word fighting, but I would just say she's controlling her environment and being patient. That's from my interpretation. What's yours, Dr. Lahab?
I think it's cunning, right? So
So
that's the
interesting.
magician's interpretation. Is I think she's cunning. She's figuring out her situation and how to resolve her situation in very creative ways. One of them is like throwing her clothes off the top,
Yeah.
right? She has nothing to throw, right? So what does she do? She throws her clothes. Like, okay, I don't need these. I'm trapped. What am I going to need with clothes? I just need help.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Isn't that, I love this, what just happened. Dr. Lahab being magician archetype and his interpretation of this one subtle change in the storyline. And I'm being of the king queen archetype, and Dr. Eric being a warrior archetype of how the words that we use to signify the strength of her character. Yeah. Yeah.
And yet in different words,
Yeah.
we've in different words of expression, we all three of us picked up on all three of those things. I mean, obviously, I mean, she was cunning. She was smart. That's what I meant when I said she used her insight and her understanding to figure things out. It's the same thing. It's just different words. And so we all come to the same thing. The end word that I use is the action. I want to know what she's going to do to take action. And
that's the archetype, though.
And that's
that's what Dr. Lisa's saying.
I'm not disputing that, but
that you're exactly stating what Dr. Lisa's talking about.
I know, and I'm not. That's why I said I'm not disputing it. I'm just saying that having an archetype of warrior and coming to the end conclusion of how she's going to operate with everything doesn't mean that those other things weren't understood beforehand by my archetype, because
nobody said your archetype didn't understand anything. What was said was, and let me see if I could explain what Dr. Lisa's saying, is that depending on your archetypal configuration or pattern that you lean towards or leans into you, or guides you or moves you, your language and the way you figure out the situation is very different from the other patterns. Each pattern has a way of doing something. And in this story, what's beautiful about the story is what Dr. Lisa's talking about, is that there are archetypal patterns to each of the ways she moves in the story. And that way we could see all the different patterns that she has. These are all the patterns make her up, right? The warrior who comes is a brother. The wanderer, he doesn't even have a name. We know it's a part of her. The fear, the attacker, the kidnapper, the one who's holding her hostage. On top of that, pagoda, shadow, animus, danger, right? But also magical. They fly, they change shapes, they're evil. So all of these different aspects create the four archetypes. So what's beautiful about the story is we are the four archetypes, so we're talking about the four archetypes, right? The lover, the warrior, the magician. Who are the kings and queens? Well, her parents. When the wanderer goes, her parents recognize her, and so the king and queen are the ones who send the warrior out to retrieve her. So these are all right. This is the archetypal configuration, and this is how it works in this kind of way that Emma Young curtailed the story to make all the different aspects of the diamond really apparent, so you could see it shining from all different sides.
And I agree with both of you 100%. All I'm trying to do is make sure that some of our listeners may not get the impression or don't get the impression that if you're an archetype, you're only going to be able to respond one way. Because all three of us, even though our final outcome used different words, all three of us engaged in the understanding of the cunningness, of the austere control, and of the resistance that the three of us brought up independently. And I want them to understand that to make sure they understand that you can have a certain archetype, but it doesn't mean that you don't have access to the abilities of the other archetypes as well.
I thought I was being clear. I'm sorry, Lisa. Go ahead.
I'll flat out admit it. I never thought of the word cunning. I never thought of the word fighting. Those did not come in my vocabulary until you said it. But once you said it, I can go, oh, I understand that. I have emotional understanding of how that can be applied in the storyline. And then like, oh, I saw a different way to see her in the storyline. From a warrior perspective, in understanding these subtle little pivotal points in her story, as a warrior, I can see this. Or going, okay, if she is a magician and see that, how would a magician work through this and using those story pieces? But I did not see those words at all.
Okay, are you telling me, Dr. Lisa, that you did not see in her character at any point in time that she was resisting what she was up against?
Nope.
You never saw any resistance in her at all. You saw
that was not a primary word.
I didn't say primary. Well, say primary.
Okay, wait. All right. Well, I will say, Eric, yeah, she made a choice, and that choice she did say no. So in that case, yeah, there was a resistance. But it wasn't the primary focus to me. That wasn't the detail. To me, the detail, I was like, oh, she's denying instant gratification, knowing that she will have to accept some suffering, okay, isolation, and fear of the unknown future to create and be opportunistic and pivotal. This is not a warrior way of looking at things. It is not a warrior way. This is my way as a king queen archetype to read that storyline. So that choice of denial of instant gratification was just small So, but I didn't really see that.
as a warrior,
Dr.
I
Eric,
understand what
Dr.
you.
Eric, Dr. Eric.
Yeah.
Let Dr. Lisa finish, please.
And so when we are working through this storyline, each of us going, ooh, what words would you choose to describe this change in storyline? For me, that was fascinating. For me, it was reflective of how each and all, it's not that we don't understand the other's perspectives or don't understand that choice was made or she was cunning to drop her clothes to identify her. Of course, I have a different interpretation about her dropping her clothes. It's cunning. I would say that's solution based. This is opportunity solution based, but I wouldn't use the word cunning because that's my archetype. This is how I focus on this story and how I read it. So for me, this whole discussion with you, with all three of us having different archetypes and just seeing how we interpret the story is super fascinating, and I'm really enjoying it. And I love being able to share with each other, and it reflects how we are unique and different, and yet we are understanding the significance of the story in general. It's pretty great.
Yeah. I see her as one, right? So my interpretation is that she's not separate archetypes. She is amplifying the archetypal patterns in the external.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because think of this as a dream. Forget fairy tale. Think of it as a dream. Okay. So all these pieces are a part of her. Same thing in the fairy tale. The demon is a part of her. The wanderer is a part of her. The lover is a part of her. Her parents are a part of her. These are internal archetypal patterns. So you're looking at one being and you're looking at them from 4 different lenses. You're still staring at one being. You just, like you said, Dr. Lisa and Dr. Eric, you're looking at them in different ways, their response in different ways. So then you start to recognize the archetypal patterns. That doesn't mean all the other archetypal patterns don't exist within you. We have all 4 archetypal patterns. We lean into one archetypal pattern, or the archetypal, to be more accurate. The archetypal pattern leans into us and moves us in certain ways. One more than the others. One has more influence over us than the other archetypal patterns. And that's what happens. And that's why we lean. And we could talk about resistance. We talk about fighting. We talk about conflict. Or we talk about cunning. We talk about outwitting. We talk about outsmarting, outplaying. Or we talk about what is how we create hierarchy, or how things move, and how she should do things, and how she should stand up for herself, or how she should face the world.
Resourcefulness.
Resourcefulness is the term. Thank you, Dr. Lisa. So with these, we're basically, what we're giving is color to the archetypal pattern. We're just coloring in the pieces, so the pattern, you could see the pattern and it's much clearer. That's what we're doing in this story, right? And she liberates herself because she is able to access all 4 archetypal patterns. Okay, so resistance alone, right, Dr. Eric? Resistance alone will not save her. Throwing down her clothes to the lover will not save her. If the lover does not go to the parents, to the king and queen, the warrior doesn't come. If the warrior doesn't come, she's still stuck up there. So all these are moving pieces, and each moving piece in itself creates a dynamic, energetic movement towards wholeness or a solution.
And all of those types are within her, correct? And all
Absolutely.
those types, that's the only point I was
And
trying
everybody,
to make.
everybody
I
has has
I
the four
agree.
archetypal patterns.
I agree 100% that one is more dominant than the other overall. But I also agree that we use all of them.
Mhm.
And
Well,
this,
absolutely, you
and
have to.
that was the point I was trying to make and did a poor job of making it, because whether we have the words for it or not, we have the understanding of them. And that makes a part of our decisions, whether we're conscious of them or not. And that's what I was trying to say. So I'm not disagreeing with you or Lisa at all.
Nobody said you were, Dr. Eric.
I'm
We're
well,
just
it could have given the appearance that I was, and I'm just stating for the record that I wasn't.
Okay.
okay.
I think we're all on board.
I think the record is this is a recorded podcast, so you are on the record whether you like it or not, brother. Just to give you a heads up, you know, everything you say can and will be used. This is how it works.
I want to move this to a different person.
Yeah,
let's not go into that room, Dr. Lahab.
Let's move
We're
it
gonna
towards
go
the
back.
light.
I want to bring something up. We do, out of the four archetypes, we do not have a lover archetype with us. So I'm gonna throw in my, like, if I were a lover archetype, how would I have read the story a little bit? And where does the lover in her come in? Or how is the lover the powerful one here, or the prominent one? And I was like, okay, I think maybe in her is the lover that she's able to avoid unwanted aggressions from the demon through all that time of being able to create some space for her to be able to have that resistance and have that safe space and have an opportunity to be cunning. She was able to make the demon just not have unwanted attention so she could have that space. And maybe that was a lover in her. It's like, what do you two think?
I agree with you 100%, because the lover is a sensory type. They're into sensory phenomenon and experience. And if that is under control, they're going to pick up feeling states. They're going to sense feelings that come from this person, this ogre, that other people are not going to immediately identify with. And I completely agree with you that that's where the lover would, that's one of the main places the lover would go with their response.
Yeah, so the lover archetype has an emotional IQ, a high emotional IQ, and therefore they're in tune to the other person's wants, needs, feeling states, much more attuned than the other archetypes. That's the power of the lover archetype, right? Each archetype has its own power, ability, if you may. Okay. Well, this was a fascinating story. I really, really enjoyed this story. I hope everybody else did too. With that, we're going to sign off for this week. Dr. Lisa, do you have any last words for this episode?
Each and every day is a new day, and there's a whole lot of different perspectives that we can share with each other.
That's fantastic.
Talk to your friends, talk to each other.
We love it. Dr. Eric, what would you like to say to our listeners, our audience, our...
I just appreciate you being there, and I hope this type of study helps you to see things in yourself that you normally or typically may not have seen.
Well, with that, as always, we leave you with the words, I am not afraid.
I am not afraid.
I am not afraid.
We are not afraid, and we are the four archetypes. See you next week.